and welcome to Aviation Deep Dive. It's the 1930s, and across the world, advancements in aerodynamics, hydrodynamics, and engine power are allowing aircraft to become bigger and better. Seaplanes, too, are entering their golden age, getting to the size of ships and carrying passengers all around the world in luxury akin to a cruise ship. The aircraft that we're looking at today, born of this era, is rather interestingly the largest floatplane of all time. Heralding from Italy, sporting 4 radial engines and being almost 30 meters or 100 feet long, today we'll be taking a look at the history of the CANT Z.511. Italy had initially been late to the civil aviation sector, and didn't really try its hand at serious native design or production until the 1920s. Having said that, once they did, their aviation industry bloomed, making leaps and bounds technologically and producing some really excellent aircraft. In 1933 and 34, the Macchi MC-72 set the world speed record for any aircraft. Its 1934 record still makes it the fastest piston engine powered seaplane of all time, reaching 709 kilometers an hour. The CANT Z.506, produced just 3 years later, would go down in history as one of the best military seaplanes ever produced. Italy was certainly making a name for itself in the sphere of hydroplanes. As such, in mid-1937, the civil aviation company Compagnia Aleatoria issued a specification to the now centralized Italian aviation industry. They wanted a long-range seaplane that would be capable of carrying a large number of passengers and cargo on transatlantic routes to Latin America. CANT, otherwise known as the Trieste Shipbuilding and Naval Aeronautics Company, immediately accepted the specification and began design of an aircraft to meet this specification. Between September 29th and October 1st, 1937, Filippo Zapata, chief of design, sketched out a design for the largest floatplane in the world, 4-engined, fast, and with a very promising design on paper. By December 1939, the construction of the first Z.511 prototype was almost complete, with the second just behind. But the program had hit a roadblock to do with the engine that had been originally intended to power the aircraft. The Alfa Romeo 135 was a twin-row 18-cylinder radial engine that could produce an incredible 1,600 horsepower at full power. And though it had certainly looked a promising power plant for the project in 1935, 4 years later the engine was still nowhere near reliable enough for operational use. It routinely broke its camshaft and had significant general issues. Despite its technical problems, the Alfa Romeo 135 was originally so promising and boasting such a high power output that the Luftwaffe bought some in 1944 for testing on Focke-Wulf Condors, but that's a story for another day. Regardless, they were certainly not in a good enough state to power the Z.511 in 1939, so the designers had to look elsewhere for a suitable power plant. Looking across the Atlantic, they were apparently taken by the US-built Wright R2600 twin Cyclone, which matched the power output of the Alfa Romeo engine but was far more reliable. CANT lodged a request with the authorities to ask permission to order 6 of these engines, but due to deteriorating relations, they were unable to secure the order. As such, the flight tests were delayed for a further year until 1940, until finally the company was able to secure some Piaggio P12 RC35 18-cylinder radials. These had the advantage of being homegrown, but they were a far cry from the Wright Cyclones. Their power output was good at 1,500 horsepower, but they suffered from poor reliability and were generally considered a worse alternative. Regardless, it was the only engine suitably powerful that the Italians could muster, so it was fitted to the first prototype, finally completing the aircraft. Standing at 11 meters tall, 28.5 meters in length, and 40 meters in span, the CANT Z.511 was by far the largest floatplane ever constructed to this point. Even just one of its enormous pontoons was almost 20 meters long, about as long as a B-17 Flying Fortress. Sporting a very beautiful streamlined look, The aircraft was of all-metal construction. The wings, in fact, would be so tall that there was a space in the leading edges, tall enough for a man to walk through, who could service the engines and fuel tanks during flight. The majority of the fuel would be kept in the wing tanks, with a smaller auxiliary fuselage tank, for a total fuel capacity of 16,340 liters, or about 4,340 US gallons. Now ready for flight tests, the Z.511 was moved to Monfalcone in northern Italy, and in October 1940, the month the Italians would begin their invasion of Greece, the Z.511 took to the skies, piloted by Mario Stoppani. Zapata, the aircraft designer, was also on board, but the first flight would not be an easy one. Almost immediately having taken off, the Z.511 was taken off course by an extremely strong gust of wind, and it was found that the ailerons were completely unresponsive. In a very risky situation, the officials on the ground watched as the enormous Italian floatplane flew off, at the mercy of the winds and only being able to steer a little with the rudder. Stoppani, the pilot, was very skillfully able to bring the aircraft in an enormous circuit using the differential thrust of the engines and the rudder to turn, and eventually made it back to the lake for a safe landing. It transpired that the rods which connected the control column to the ailerons had apparently become wet and thus expanded, meaning that there was a huge amount of slack in the rod. Zapata, presumably rather shaken by this encounter, immediately set about redesigning the control system in the wings, replacing the elastic pulleys with rigid rods. The whole ordeal took about 3 months to complete. Following this, the Z.511 continued undergoing flight tests at various lows and in different conditions. On one flight, the aircraft made a very intense landing at sea with 6-foot waves and 40-mile-an-hour winds. The engineer was sure that the floats would collapse or simply be destroyed from the stress, but the aircraft took the pounding from the waves and was even able to take off again, not to mention that at the time the aircraft had been at its fully loaded weight of 34,000 kilograms, or about 75,000 pounds. This proved the structural integrity of the aircraft beyond question. It was incredibly ruggedly built. For context, most floatplanes are limited to landing in swell no higher than 12 inches or 30 centimeters. This was 6 times that. The speed of the aircraft also ended up being fairly respectable, using its combined 6,000 horsepower to achieve a maximum speed of 424 kilometers an hour at 3,500 meters. Overall, testing was certainly considered to be a success, but by this time it was already mid-1942. And interest was rapidly dwindling away from civilian aircraft. Italy wanted designs that could function in a military application. The second prototype had been disassembled to make space in CANT's workshop for other projects, and in order to appease Italian officials and possibly secure some actual orders for the aircraft, a military conversion of the Z.511 began to be explored. It was considered that due to its enormous size and range, it could be well suited to the maritime patrol role. It could be fitted with racks to carry ordnance on the outer wings, as well as an internal bomb bay, and leave lots of space and available weight for defensive armament. And defensive armament was indeed suggested, in the form of no less than 10 single-mount 12.7mm Breda machine guns in both side positions, 2 dorsal turrets, and belly positions. Furthermore, a 20mm MG151 cannon would be mounted in the glazed nose, making this an extraordinarily well-defended aircraft, one of the most heavily armed aircraft of the war. Aside from guns, however, the aircraft would carry up to 4,000 pounds of bombs or torpedoes to be put to use against any enemy ships it came across in its 15 hours of endurance. An interesting feature of the Z.511 is that it would have been able to carry up to 4 533mm torpedoes, which is actually more than any other World War II aircraft, at least that I know of. It's interesting to note that although its military conversion program ultimately came to nothing, it could feasibly have replaced Focke-Wulf 200 Condors, as the two types have a fair amount of similarities, at least superficially. Both converted from airliners into maritime patrol bombers, the Z.511 is basically just better in every aspect. Its payload, speed, defensive armament, and even range could be better, provided it got some extra tanks. The Z.511 was also incredibly strong, as was discovered in testing, whereas the Condor was always plagued by structural issues that stemmed from its ill-suited conversion to carry a lot of heavy military equipment. Its back would often break on landing. Anyway, desperate to find a use for the Z.511, it was suggested in roles such as a troop transport to fly groups of Italian saboteurs into important enemy sectors, as well as in a transatlantic crossing to Latin America, even using it on solo strike missions to target fuel warehouses in the Persian Gulf or Soviet vessels in the Black Sea, as well as an idea to fit it with a midget submarine that would be flown in and drop deep into enemy waters. But ultimately, the finished prototype stayed moored at its lake in northern Italy, whilst the half-built one stayed mostly disassembled in its facility. The Z.511 took its last flight in September 1943 and was just days later strafed by marauding British fighters on the lake, which caused serious damage, although it did stay afloat. Transferred to Vigna di Valle for repairs, by this time the Allies had invaded and were sweeping across southern Italy, and the workers at the base apparently did not want it to fall into either Allied or German hands, and so they sabotaged and destroyed the aircraft. The other Z.511, still half-built, was seized by German forces and scrapped for metals, thus bringing a sudden and sad end to the only two Z.511s in existence. This aircraft has remained shrouded in mystery, far more mysterious than anything of its size should be. For this video, I was only able to find a handful of pictures, and references to it in books are few and far between. Any detail is exceedingly rare, and I've had to gauge most of it from second-hand accounts from historians that have visited Italian archives. Nevertheless, the Z.511 is certainly deserving of attention, as it was no doubt a pretty incredible aircraft. Brainchild of the legendary aeronautical engineer Filippo Zapata, the Z.511 proved itself to be rugged, reliable, fairly fast, and a high-capacity aircraft, and one that would simply never really catch on, due to the fact that its development coincided with its intended passenger route being cut off after the outbreak of war. Unfortunately, fate was not kind to the legacy of this aircraft, and both were completely destroyed, and now we're only left with images and blueprints to remember this extraordinary aircraft by. A huge thanks to my patrons on screen now for supporting the channel, and thank you so much for watching this video of Aviation Deep Dive. Consider liking and subscribing for more weekly content, and please also consider supporting us on Patreon. See you in the skies.